See, the thing about a unidirectional and even an authoritarian state is that it's possible now and then that it can be more efficient if it gets lucky and is going in the direction that works at the time. And that's fine until something changes, which it most certainly will. And one of the things that's so amazing about the United States, and I've watched this happen time and time again because I'm old enough to have seen it, is that no matter what problems emerge in your country, there's a bunch of people somewhere who are already working to solve it, because it is a free country and it is characterized by genuine diversity and distributed autonomy. And so you guys go in the wrong direction and you hit a wall, and what happens is a bunch of people who were working in the opposite direction pop up and say, hey, over here, this is working. How about we try this? And away you go. And it works over and over. And so you might not be as efficient in the short run now and then. And you might have even said that about Japan versus the United States in the 1980s, say, when Japan was such a powerhouse and was heading in a single direction in some sense. But the Japanese couldn't manage failure, partly because they couldn't let large enterprises, you hear that mantra, too big to fail, eh? It's like, no, so big it will certainly fail. That's the proper mantra. And the Japanese couldn't let their devastated and archaic systems collapse, whereas you Americans, you'll let things fail, or you've been pretty good at that. And what that does is open up a space for things to succeed. And so the Chinese could gain an edge in the short term, but they also have a president for life and a social credit system. And so that doesn't really seem like progress to me. And I think it will stultify them in the final analysis. America is so creative. You look at Silicon Valley, you have such a concentration of brilliant and creative people there. It's unparalleled. It's an unparalleled pool of stunning talent. You don't know where the next solution to the problem is going to emerge. And so you guys are perfectly willing to let 1,000, 100,000, 500,000 experiments flourish. And so then when something does go wrong, a multitude of solutions are already at hand. And you can't get that in the absence of genuine political and economic freedom. So, no, I don't have any faith at all in China's ability to prevail in any fundamental sense over any reasonable span of time. I'd bet on the US and I'd bet on the West, as long as we don't do our institutions in because of all the guilt that we seem compelled to foist upon ourselves in a unthinking manner. I'd bet on free and diverse economies just like everyone else bets on them. People put their money in the American stock market, and rich Chinese do exactly the same when they're allowed to, and no bloody wonder. So, no.
It reminds me of Winston Churchill's comment that democracy is the worst form of government out there, with the exception of every other type of government that he's ever seen.
Right. Well, that's kind of essential to I would say something like an appropriate conservative ethos. It's like, yeah, it's flawed, but it's not as flawed as your utopian vision. You have to accept that, and even appreciate the flaw in some sense. You have to appreciate the flaws in some sense, and that's a hard thing to learn. You have to be a pretty sophisticated thinker before you're willing to see the inadequacies of a system as part of what actually makes it great. And every time I come to the United States, and I've traveled across the U.S. a lot. I think I've been to virtually every state and pretty much every major city. And the wealth of infrastructure here is stunning. And the creativity of the populace is amazing. And the desire of people to maintain their freedom is remarkable. And the entrepreneurial spirit that imbues the country and that gives it this sense of drama and purpose isn't manifest to the same degree anywhere else in the world. And, we could turn everything into hell with enough stupidity, and maybe we will, but all things considered, I'd still bet on the US and the West for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. Now, whether AI can replace general intelligence, that depends to some degree on exactly how you define intelligence. You can define it as the first factor that emerges across tests of ability that require abstraction. That's a good way of defining it. It isn't obvious to me that we have intelligent machines that fit that criteria yet. And then discriminating intelligence from consciousness, that's also a very tricky problem. So we do have AI systems that can replicate complex automatable processes. We're on the brink of explosions in all sorts of technology, assuming we don't decimate ourselves in the next few years. And by the time we hit the point of radical population decrease, things will have changed so much that I don't think that question is answerable. I mean, obviously, one of the things that's going to happen is that our ability to produce quasi-intelligent machines will address the labor shortage to some degree. But it's too far, the time horizon's too expanded for me to speculate. I don't even know what's going to happen in 2 years, let alone 20. I do think the population decrease I don't think it's a good thing. Everyone seems to think it's a good thing, except perhaps Elon Musk. I don't think it's a good thing at all. I think it's indication that society has lost its way in a fundamental sense to see population growth fall below replacement. It hasn't happened everywhere. I mean, there'll be more people in Nigeria than in China by the end of the century, which is quite the stunning statistic. And certainly the West is doing its best to empty itself out as rapidly as possible, but it's also Korea. Korea has an extremely low birth rate. Japan has an extremely low birth rate. It's a sign of the demoralization of a population, in my estimation. People who think diversity, inclusivity, and equity just means we're no longer racist have no idea what system of ideas is driving this entire enterprise, which is also predicated on the idea that our implicit cognitions, as measured by the implicit association test, are fundamentally racist despite our explicit wishes, and even more preposterously, that those implicit biases can be modified by explicit training programs, which isn't even justifiable by the tenets of the theory itself. And so what are the consequences of implementing that? Well, I can tell you what's happening in the research enterprise in Canada, and this is happening in the US too. You can't get a research grant in Canada, and all you MIT STEM types who don't have a political bone in your body have better be watching out for this, because you're going to get steamrollered by the ideologues who have a way better grasp of political reality than you guys do while you're concentrating on your vitally important research, as you should be. In Canada, you can't get a research grant to do engineering or hard science work unless you write a diversity statement. Well, now you've subsumed your science to the diversity claims. It's like, and here, let's think this through. Okay, so I've been an academic at high-level institutions for 40 years, basically, including McGill, where I was a graduate student, and I've watched hiring committees operate at the universities. I defy anyone to find any hiring committees that have ever been established by anyone ever anywhere in human history that have been as fair in their application of the demand for competence as university faculty hiring committees. We've never done better ever than we did in the last 30 years. And now we're willing to swallow this absolutely preposterous notion foisted on us by incompetent HR professionals who are undertrained, accusing us of an implicit bias that we can't control, that they could fix and should fix and have to fix, by the way, by the imposition of these incredible, scientifically unjustified training programs. And so what's the consequence of that? Let moralizing fools run your important enterprises and see what happens. Now, I noticed that MIT, for example, dropped the math SAT requirement. Well, you know what? You guys, you're the greatest engineering school in the world. Yeah, that actually turns out to be important, really important. And now you say, well, objective tests, they don't matter. It's like, yeah, well, good luck with that proposition. So I cannot understand how business people, and academics for that matter, who are perhaps even worse, can be so blind as to let in a fifth column, essentially, predicated on the notion that capitalist systems and patriarchal systems in general are fundamentally unjust and racist, and then to promote that as evidence of their open-heartedness and willingness to deal with racism.